Welcome, dear listener, to another journey back in time where the shadows of history come alive in the gentle glow of storytelling. Tonight, we travel to a darker chapter of our past, where courage was measured not in battlefield glory, but in quiet steps through plague-ridden streets. As you settle in, perhaps drawing a blanket closer or dimming the lights, allow the tensions of your day to slowly release with each breath. This tale, like all our historical journeys, is designed to help you unwind, to create a space where curiosity about our shared human past might gently guide you toward peaceful rest. The rhythm of history has its own soothing quality when we approach it with calm reflection. I'm always delighted to know where in our wide world you're listening from. Perhaps you're settling in for the evening in London, catching a midday break in Singapore, or greeting the early morning in California. Wherever you are, whatever time it is for you, I invite you to share in the comments below. It brings me such joy to see our community of history enthusiasts gathering from across the globe. If these journeys into the past bring you comfort or fascination, consider subscribing so you won't miss our next expedition through time. Each story is a doorway to another era, waiting for you to step through whenever you need a moment of escape. Now, let us leave behind the electric lights and digital screens of our modern world. Close your eyes if you wish, and let us drift back nearly 7 centuries to northern Italy in the year 1348, where a young physician is about to face the greatest challenge of his life. Thomas Mercurio wiped the sweat from his brow as he closed the door behind him, the weight of what he had just witnessed pressing down upon his shoulders like a physical burden. "God have mercy," he whispered, his back against the rough wooden door of the apothecary where he had apprenticed for the past 3 years. Inside, his master lay dying, black swellings the size of figs protruding from his neck and armpits. The old man had been fined just 2 days prior, mixing tinctures and lecturing Thomas on the proper balance of humors. Now he gasped for breath, his skin mottled with dark blotches that had given this pestilence its fearsome name, the Black Death. The narrow streets of Siena seemed different today, as though the very stones had absorbed the growing fear. Thomas had heard the rumors for months, tales from merchants who spoke of entire villages in the south being swallowed by an invisible enemy. But like many, he had believed the city walls and the blessings of the church would keep them safe. Now the plague was here, slipping through the gates with travelers and traders, caring nothing for wealth or station. "Another physician gone," said a voice behind him. Thomas turned to find Councilman Orsini, his normally immaculate robes rumpled, his eyes sunken from lack of sleep. "That makes 5 this week. How fares Maestro Donati?" Thomas could only shake his head in response, and the councilman's face fell further. "Then God welcome him among the saints. But we cannot spare you for mourning, young Mercurio. The council requires your presence at the Palazzo Pubblico immediately." Without waiting for a response, Orsini turned and began walking toward the city center, clearly expecting Thomas to follow. The Grand Council Chamber, normally a place of measured debate and political maneuvering, had transformed into a chamber of crisis. 8 of the 12 council seats stood empty. Their occupants either fled to country estates already claimed by the pestilence. Those remaining looked haggard, their faces masks of exhaustion and fear. "Physician Mercurio," began the head councilman, dispensing with the usual formalities. "Our situation grows dire. We have lost nearly all our experienced doctors. The hospitals overflow. The gravediggers cannot keep pace." He gestured to a side table where something lay covered with a cloth. "We have received word from Venice of a method they have employed with some success. Their physicians have adopted special garments to protect themselves while treating the afflicted." With ceremonial gravity, the councilman pulled away the cloth, revealing what appeared at first glance to be the costume of a strange bird. A long, curved beak protruded from a hooded mask with crystal discs where eyes should be. Beside it lay thick gloves and a heavy waxed leather robe. "This is to be your armor against contagion," the councilman explained. "The beak is filled with herbs and spices to purify the miasma before it reaches your lungs. The robe is soaked in wax to repel the corrupted air. The staff," he indicated a long wooden cane, "is to examine patients without touching them directly." Thomas stared at the bizarre outfit, his heart sinking. In that moment, he understood what was being asked of him. He was no longer simply a physician's apprentice. He was to become a plague doctor, walking among the dying when all others fled. I have not completed my training," he stammered, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "You have more knowledge than anyone left willing to serve," replied the councilman simply. "We will pay 40 florins per month, 3 times the usual physician's salary. The city needs you, Thomas. Your people need you." The unspoken truth hung in the air between them. Few plague doctors survived more than a few weeks of service. With trembling hands, Thomas lifted the mask. It was heavier than it appeared, the beak stuffed with dried roses, mint, camphor, cloves, laudanum, myrrh, and amber. The council chamber fell silent as he slipped the hood over his head, the world immediately narrowing to what he could see through the small glass eyepieces. His breath echoed loudly in his ears, hot and moist against his face as it bounced back from the herbs. The robe came next, stiff and unyielding, the waxed leather creaking with each movement. By the time the gloves were on, Thomas could barely feel his fingers, the thick material removing all dexterity a physician required. Sweat began to form immediately beneath the layers, with no way to escape. The final piece was a wide-brimmed black hat, marking him as a doctor of death. How am I to treat patients like this?" Thomas asked, his voice muffled and strange from within the mask. "I can scarcely move my hands." He attempted to demonstrate by trying to mimic the motion of checking a pulse, his fingers clumsy and unresponsive in the heavy gloves. "You are not expected to cure," said the councilman quietly. "Comfort where you can. Record the dead. Identify new cases. That is all any man can do now." He handed Thomas a ledger bound in leather. "Begin in the Santa Maria district. God go with you, Dr. Mercurio." Thomas stepped out into the street, instantly drawing stares and signs of the cross from passers-by. Children who had been playing stopped to point, while adults shrank back against walls to avoid his path. The weight of the costume was already becoming unbearable in the Italian summer heat, sweat running freely down his back and chest. Through the glass eyepieces, the familiar streets of his hometown looked distorted and strange, as though he had stepped into a nightmare from which he could not awaken. The morning bell of the cathedral tolled 6 times as Thomas made his way through the winding streets of Santa Maria district, his wooden staff tapping rhythmically against the cobblestones. "Bring out your dead," he called, his voice muffled behind the leather mask, the words a ritual he had already repeated dozens of times since dawn. The narrow alleyways reeked of human waste and the sickly sweet odor of decay that no amount of aromatic herbs in his mask could fully disguise. "Bring out your dead," he called again, pausing before a door marked with a crude white cross, the universal symbol that plague had visited this household. A haggard man emerged, eyes hollow with grief. "My wife," he whispered, gesturing inside. "She passed in the night." Thomas nodded solemnly and withdrew his ledger from a pouch at his side, the leather gloves making his writing clumsy as he recorded another death. "Maria Benelli, aged approximately 30 years, he murmured, noting the address. "May God receive her soul." The man stared at him with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. My children, they share the same bed. Will they... Thomas felt the familiar knot of helplessness tighten in his chest. Burn the bedding, he advised, knowing it would likely make little difference. Wash them with vinegar water, and give them this. He handed over a small pouch of dried herbs, thyme, rosemary, and wormwood, knowing full well their efficacy was questionable at best. By midday, Thomas had visited 14 households, documented 11 deaths, and identified 7 new cases showing the telltale buboes, the swollen lymph nodes that marked almost certain death. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the inside of his waxed leather costume into an unbearable furnace. Sweat pooled at his feet inside his boots, and his vision blurred through the glass eyepieces fogged with condensation. At the home of merchant Vincenzo Alberti, a servant met him at the door with undisguised contempt. "The master says you are to treat his son immediately," the man said, not bothering to hide his disgust at Thomas's appearance. "And he warns you not to try any of your barbaric treatments that killed the baker's family." The Alberti home was a mansion compared to the hovels Thomas had visited earlier. Inside, rich tapestries lined walls that in poorer homes would be bare stone, and the air smelled of incense rather than filth. The merchant himself stood by his son's bedside, a boy of perhaps 12 years who lay feverish and moaning. "You," Alberti spat when Thomas entered, "I pay your salary through my taxes, so you will cure my son or answer to me." Thomas bowed slightly, accustomed now to being treated as something less than human in his plagued garb. "I will do what I can, signore," he replied, approaching the boy. The examination revealed what Thomas had seen countless times: the blackened buboes beneath the arms and at the neck, the fever, the delirium. "I must lance the swellings," he explained, removing a small knife from his bag. "And then we must draw blood to balance his humors." "Do it quickly," Alberti commanded, though Thomas noted he stepped back several paces. The boy screamed when the knife pierced the first bubo, releasing a foul-smelling pus that made even Thomas, now somewhat accustomed to such horrors, fight the urge to gag. The bloodletting that followed left the child weaker, and Thomas mixed a concoction of ground herbs with wine, forcing it between the boy's cracked lips. "He needs rest now," Thomas said, knowing in his heart that the child would likely not survive the night, "and prayer." Alberti's face contorted with rage. "Prayer! I paid for medicine, not prayers. Get out! Get out before I have you flogged." Thomas gathered his implements quickly, backing toward the door as the merchant hurled a silver cup that clanged against his mask. "Useless butcher! Charlatan!" The afternoon brought more of the same: more deaths to record, more futile treatments to administer, more families torn apart by grief. By the time Thomas reached the poorest section of his assigned district, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the narrow streets. At a tiny hovel near the tanneries, he found an elderly widow named Sophia tending to her adult daughter. Unlike the others, she showed no fear when she opened the door to his monstrous silhouette. "I've been expecting you, physician," she said simply, ushering him inside. The one-room dwelling was spotlessly clean despite its poverty, and herbs hung drying from the rafters. The same herbs, Thomas noted, that filled his mask. "My Lucia has been sick 3 days," Sophia explained, leading him to a pallet where a young woman lay, her breathing labored. Thomas examined her gently, finding the familiar signs. "I have seen this before," Sophia said quietly. "During the fever in Genoa when I was a girl, few survived." Thomas nodded, surprised by her calm understanding. "I can try bloodletting," he offered, though his voice lacked conviction. Sophia shook her head. "No. Just ease her pain if you can." Thomas mixed a stronger dose of poppy extract than he normally would, knowing it might hasten the end, but would certainly ease suffering. As he administered it, Sophia touched his leather-clad arm, the first person to willingly make contact with him since he had donned the plague doctor's garb. "Thank you for coming," she said simply. "Would you like some water? You must be thirsty behind that mask." The simple kindness nearly undid him. Thomas felt tears prick his eyes behind the glass lenses as he nodded. Sophia poured water from a clay pitcher into a cup and, understanding his predicament, turned her back to allow him privacy to partially remove his mask and drink. The water was cool and clean, the first he'd had since morning. "People fear what they don't understand," Sophia said without turning, "and they blame the messenger for the message. But some of us remember that there is a man behind that mask, doing what he can." Thomas replaced his mask, his throat tight with emotion. "Your daughter will sleep comfortably now," he managed to say. Sophia nodded. "That is all any of us can ask for in the end." As darkness fell, Thomas made his final entries in the ledger by torchlight. 26 dead, 19 new cases identified, countless treatments administered with little hope of success. His shoulders sagged with exhaustion as he trudged back toward his isolated quarters, the weight of the costume nothing compared to the burden he carried in his heart. Yet the widow's simple kindness sustained him, a small flame of humanity in the darkest of times. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, more death, more futility, more fear, but also perhaps another moment of connection that made his grim task bearable for one more day. The streets grew quieter as Thomas passed, conversations halting mid-sentence, mothers pulling children behind skirts, men crossing themselves. After 3 weeks serving as the city's plague doctor, Thomas had become accustomed to the paradoxical reception that greeted him wherever he went. Some residents fell to their knees, begging for examination or remedy as if he possessed divine healing powers. Others spat and made warding gestures, convinced his bird-like silhouette carried death itself from house to house. "The doctor comes! The doctor comes!" Children would chant, half in fascination, half in terror, before their parents slanced them with sharp words or frightened glances. "Please, good doctor," a haggard man called from a doorway, his face gaunt with worry. "My wife. She complains of headache and fever since yesterday. Would you look upon her?" Thomas nodded, the beak of his mask bobbing awkwardly as he followed the man inside. The familiar ritual unfolded, the terror in the woman's eyes upon seeing him, the husband's desperate hope, the examination revealing the telltale swellings beginning to form in her armpits. "Keep her comfortable," Thomas instructed, knowing his words were hollow comfort. "Brew feverfew and chamomile. I shall return tomorrow." He made his notation in the ledger, another name added to the growing list of the afflicted. The council had assigned Thomas quarters at the edge of town, a small stone cottage previously occupied by a tanner who had succumbed to the pestilence in its first wave. The isolation was intentional, a buffer between the plague doctor and the healthy population. As he approached his lonely dwelling each evening, Thomas felt the weight of separation more keenly than the heavy costume on his back. No neighbors visited, no friends called his name, no family awaited his return. His only regular companion was Councilman Orsini, who came twice weekly to receive reports and deliver payment, always standing at a careful distance in the yard, handkerchief pressed to his nose. Inside his cottage, Thomas performed his nightly ritual. He removed the suffocating mask first, gulping fresh air as if emerging from underwater. The waxed robes came next, hung carefully by the door. Finally free of his professional shell, he washed thoroughly with vinegar and herbs, scrubbing his skin until it reddened. Only then did he allow himself to reach for the wine jug, a habit he had acquired from his predecessor, and one that seemed essential to surviving this existence. To health, he muttered without irony, drinking deeply from his cup. The wine dulled the memories of the day's horrors, the blackened limbs, the blood-flecked sputum, the cries of orphaned children. Thomas was not alone in seeking solace this way. The few times he had encountered other plague doctors, at the council chambers or passing in the streets, he had recognized the same haunted look in their eyes, smelled the same wine on their breath. One older doctor, Matteo, had confided during a rare moment of camaraderie, "The wine keeps the pestilence at bay better than any herb in our beaks." They had laughed then, a bitter sound that held no mirth. 3 days later, Thomas heard that Matteo had been found dead in his quarters, not from plague but from choking on his own vomit, after a night of heavy drinking. The news had made Thomas more cautious with his own consumption, though he could not abandon the comfort entirely. Sleep came fitfully that night, as it did most nights. Thomas dreamed of Sophia, the widow who had shown him kindness, her face transforming into her daughter Lucia's, then into his own mother's face from his childhood. He woke before dawn, his sheets damp with sweat, and prepared for another day. As he donned his costume piece by piece, Thomas reflected on how the mask that terrified so many had become, paradoxically, his own protection, not just from disease, but from showing the world his growing despair. The morning brought him to a small home where 3 children huddled around their father's deathbed. The man was in his final hours, his breathing labored, his skin mottled with the characteristic black patches of advanced disease. "Will he recover, doctor?" asked the eldest boy, no more than 12 years old. Thomas knew the honest answer, but could not bear to deliver it to these children, who would soon be orphans. Instead, he knelt awkwardly in his stiff garments and placed a gloved hand on the dying man's forehead. "Your father is very ill," he said gently. "I will make him more comfortable." From his satchel, Thomas produced a small vial of poppy extract, administering a few drops beneath the man's tongue. Within minutes, the labored breathing eased, and the man's contorted features relaxed. "You have eased his pain," the boy whispered, gratitude shining through his tears. "Thank you." Thomas nodded, unexpectedly moved. He stayed longer than necessary, showing the children how to cool their father's fever with damp cloths, how to help him sip water. When he finally left, the man was sleeping peacefully, his children gathered close. Thomas knew the man would likely not see another sunset, but he had given this family a gentler parting, a small dignity in death that the plague so often denied its victims. As he continued his rounds that day, Thomas found himself lingering longer with patients, focusing less on his futile remedies and more on easing suffering. He cleaned festering sores with gentle hands, helped position the bedridden more comfortably, spoke words of comfort even through his forbidding mask. With each small act of mercy, Thomas felt something shift within him, not hope exactly, for he had seen too much to believe the pestilence would soon end, but purpose. Where medicine failed, compassion could still reach. That evening, as Thomas made his way back to his isolated cottage, a small figure darted from an alleyway. It was Sophia's grandson, a boy of perhaps 8 years. "Doctor," the child called, holding out a small cloth-wrapped bundle. "Grandmother sent this, for your kindness to my mother." Thomas accepted the package with surprise, finding inside a loaf of fresh bread and a small pot of honey. Such simple gifts, yet in that moment, they felt more precious than gold. "Tell your grandmother thank you," Thomas said, his voice thick with emotion behind his mask. The boy nodded and disappeared back into the shadows. Later, as Thomas sat alone in his cottage, savoring the sweet honey on the bread, he reflected on the strange duality of his existence. He was feared and revered, avoided and sought after, a harbinger of death who nonetheless strove to preserve life. The plague had not diminished in its virulence, his ledger still filled with names of the dead and dying each day. Yet in the small mercies he could offer, a gentle touch, a moment of dignity, a peaceful passing, Thomas had found meaning beyond mere survival. Tomorrow would bring more death, more suffering, but also more opportunities for these small acts of humanity that the mask could not hide and the plague could not destroy.